we've got here is failure to communicate. Some men you just can't reach. So you get what we had here last week, which is the way he wants it. Well, he gets it. I don't like it any more than you may.
Have you ever heard of the Cold War? You probably have, right? Well, it took place between 1945 in the end of World War II and the early 90s with the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Although no direct military conflict occurred between the two superpowers, the USSR and the USA, over that period of years, the competition for global influence, especially in terms of ideologies and economics, shaped international relationships during that time.
It is also very important to mention that the causes of this event include first the ideological differences between these two superpowers, which are the United States, which promoted capitalism and a democracy, whilst on the other hand, the Soviet Union promoted communism and a centralized government, a centrally planned economy. Another cause includes the post-World War II, because there was a power struggle between these two unions, and the United States feared the spread of communism, and the Soviet Union feared the spread of capitalism.
It is also important to mention the nuclear arms race that consisted in the development of nuclear weapons from either leaders of the blocs. This consolidated itself within the conferences that followed the Second World War.
You know what was particularly prominent in this case, and something that really powered the fire, if I could say it that way, in terms of nuclear weapons? It was when the US dropped both Big Boy and Fat Man, in Japan, in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to make them surrender, but also to show the world their power in terms of weapons. This was seen by the Soviet Union, who started their own nuclear weapons program, which eventually led to the creation of, for example, the hydrogen bomb, the most powerful atomic or nuclear weapon, if it can be called that way, ever made by man.
Now, it's important to mention that the principal consequences were basically a division of the world, because the world was largely divided into two opposing blocks, which was the Western capitalist bloc, which was obviously led by the US and its allies, and the other bloc was the Eastern Communist bloc, led by the USSR and its satellite states. And this division in a longer term resulted in the establishment of military alliances like the NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Next is the arms race and technological advancements. Basically, the arms race was part of the Cold War, but the technological advancements were a consequence of this war. And so the US and the USSR competed in space exploration, resulting in significant advances in science and technology. For example, during the government of John F. Kennedy, he was the first one. He was the first one to initiate the process of making a man go to the moon. But as he was murdered, Lyndon B. Johnson was the one that continued this goal. And so this led to the first person landing in the moon and the development of several technological innovations around the world.
It's actually interesting that you mention it, because 1961 was the first year when mankind, in this case the USSR, had their feet, if you can say it that way, or had their own technology in space with Sputnik 1, the satellite. And then in 1961, in Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, from the US part, Neil Armstrong was the first person to land in the moon. One of the most important accomplishments in the history of mankind.
An important consequence of the Cold War is also the fall of the Soviet Union. Essentially, what ultimately put an end to this problem. The Soviet Union fell when the last president of the USSR, which was Gorbachev, failed in implementing a little more open economy with private capital from the outside of the USSR. There was no economic restoration, there was no social restoration, and the Soviet Union ultimately ended up crumbling because of the instability.
If we were to mention a way in which the Cold War reflected itself, in terms of artistic medium, we could talk about songs. Have you ever heard of CCR, aka Creedence Clearwater Revival?
Yes, well, I've heard of it. Actually, there's a song called Fortunate Son by this band. It was composed by a veteran of the United States called John Fogerty. And it was released in 1969 during the Vietnam War. It addresses the issue of poor kids and teenagers being sent off to combat like arbitrarily by the US government during the period of the Cold War.
Wow. It's rather ironic now that you mention it. Fortunate Son, the title itself it reflects how hypocritical the US government got to be back in 1969 and in general in the decades of 50s, 60s and 70s, because the title itself reflects how wealthy individuals or children coming from powerful families were not in the need of going to the Vietnam War, while those that were not as privileged, like those of farmers or families living in poorer states, had to.
Exactly, and it was written as a protest, as a mode of protest against, this issue. And it was also chosen because the 20th century society understands that every single citizen should share the risk of going to war and risk their lives in defense of their country by means of several stylistic devices, including metaphors, allusions, repetitions, or apostrophes. And the lyrics makes the audience reflect about the real patriotism that should be felt by the US citizens by exposing the way in which people are corruptly benefited from the government and their socioeconomic status. So it makes a reflection upon who really feels the patriotism and why.
What a good song! Talking about protest songs, there's another very famous one that tackles another kind of fear. So here in Fortunate Son, we're talking about the fear of being recruited to go to a proxy war. But imagine having to go through the fear of the possibility of there being a nuclear warfare at any moment. So scary, right? So scary.
Yeah.
You and I in a little toy shop, buy a bag of balloons with the money we've got, set them free at the break of dawn, till one by one they were gone.
The 99 love balloons, which translates to 99 red balloons. Of course, we're going to talk about the English version, but it says the same in German. And it was written by German group Nina. It's important for us to understand that they were from the western part of Germany. So it was written by Nina, and it's a protest song that not only talks about how they were all fearful for there being a possibility of a nuclear warfare, but also it's a protest song because Germany was separated. So it is essentially a union anthem of all of the Germans, talking about how they miss their past being a powerful country, united country, before having to be taken over by the new powers so that they could be moderated and not start another war. It is very important to understand that the 99 red balloons are essentially a metaphor and a representative element for the, the nuclear things that fall from the sky.
Nuclear warfare, you mean bombs?
No, it's something else. They're like this.
Nuclear missiles?
Yeah, missiles, yeah. And it's an important allusion also to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That is when the world was closest to nuclear warfare. And they're talking about how that could have happened and how the world could at that point be empty, like post-nuclear, apocalypse.
And what's interesting?
Yeah. What's interesting?
You know what's interesting?
Yeah, go for it.
This scenario was deeply feared by the entire world, but especially by the Germans, because they were caught in the middle of a conflict that was like they had no part in, where nuclear fatality could take place even right at either side of the Berlin Wall.
Zum Horizont sieht man für UFOs aus dem All. Warum schickte ein General Fliegerstaffeln hinterher? Alarm zu geben, wenn's so wär. Dabei waren dort am Horizont nur 99 Luftballons.
Our final song in English is very, very famous song. 80s anthem actually, 1985. Everybody Wants to Rule the World. Written by Kurt Smith and Roland Ortabal in conjunction with their group, which is known as Tears for Fears. We chose it because it's one of the most prominent examples of the Cold War itself. It explores what the seek for power truly means and establishes an intimate connection with the audience, since it addresses corruption and the catastrophic consequences the possible nuclear war could have had if it had happened for the world as a whole. It was published in a decade as critical and full of uncertainties as the 80s, and it represents one of the main exponents of the new wave genre that gave a more pop rock to the, topics of the Cold War. Because as we could see, Fortunate Son is rather country rock, while this is more of a pop rock song. It involved newer generations and, it really tried to shout out loud the inconformities that living in a world that could end in just an instant meant, you know?
And you know what's interesting? That they also use a lot of illustrative devices to make the audience understand this issue, but it's also important the fact that it was entertainment, like with an entertainment purpose, because it made it easier for people to stick to the message. And so among those illustrative devices are metaphors, analogies, and analogies especially to the nuclear war and how this affected people at the time.
You know what I find really interesting? That this one and the previous one, of course, Fortunate sounds very different from these two, but I believe that the 99 Balloons one is like the German equivalent to the Everybody Wants to Rule the World one, because they talk about the same thing and the same fear, and they're also very happy, jolly sounding songs, but they have a very obscure meaning.
They do. For example, in here, in Everybody Wants to Rule the World, there is a part, a verse, which we're going to listen right ahead, yeah. That says, which alludes to the secret projects that were being carried by the two superpowers.
I guess we could mention the CIA MK Ultra in that sense, because the term "where the light won't find you." If we take a look at the CIA's history, we can see the deep secrets regarding drugs, regarding experiments, regarding mental illnesses they conducted in secret facilities. And this song, Everybody Wants to Rule the World, indirectly addresses this issue, which was then uncovered decades later. Well, it's actually quite interesting to see how many artistical media we have to take a look at the Cold War. But we've only talked about English songs. How about one in the Latin American context? Well, Cuando Seas Grande is a song written by Miguel Mateos, an important Argentinian author. And it is a song that puts into evidence one of the most important aspects of the Cold War, which is the uncertainty for the future and what it means for younger generations. As we can see, these four songs all carry pretty much the same message, which pretty much relates to the sense of fear and what could happen if a nuclear war were to start. This 1986 piece explores what growing up in such a world means and how the destruction of the world was up to the two main protagonists of this conflict, both the USSR and the US. One of the main references that can be seen in order to understand this message is the mentioning of the red button. All along the chorus of the song. The red button reflects the step itself that would have to be taken by both the USSR and the US to just fire a missile and perhaps end the world in just an instant. He also makes rhetorical questions to the youngest on what will be of their life, with the many conflicts that the Cold War had involved up until that point.
And I think it's also important to mention that the fact that we are using as an example several songs around the world, for instance Germany or the US or in here in Latin America, reflects how global this problem was and like the importance it had on every single well, not on every single, but in most of the countries around the world, which illustrates like the strength of the consequences it had up to now. Not only was this conflict reflected in songs, but also in movies. An example of this is Rambo: First Blood Part 2. So in here we see soldier Rambo being recruited for a mission in the famous Vietnam War. And some scenes in this movie discuss the immoral actions the leading world powers would take to sabotage each other and to cut down on war costs. Rambo specifically criticizes supposed actions of the US government towards American soldiers held hostage in Vietnam. How about we take a look at some examples from the film?
So the first scene that we chose goes from minute 45:50 to 47:57. And as you know, here Rambo was recruited for a mission in Vietnam. So what is happening there is that Marshall Murdoch, who is essentially Rambo's representative, goes up to Colonel Troutman, who's the one that recruited him all the way from Vietnam to get there. And he confronts him about how the mission that Rambo was supposed to do was actually a farce and how it was like foul play from the United States to Vietnam. As we know, the United States government, the United States administration had sent a lot of soldiers to Vietnam to fight the war, to fight against the guerrilla, which is, you know, the Viet Cong. And they didn't really like resolve anything. They were just there and they kept on sending young people, as it is said in this song, the Fortunate Son one.
Yeah.
And that's what people were protesting, because they were sending so many people there and they weren't achieving anything in Vietnam anyway. So what was supposed to happen is that because they weren't really achieving anything and they were only destroying Vietnam a little more, they owed, like the United States government owed Vietnam war reparations. But to skip having to pay for these war reparations, what they did, like their plan was like to say that there were war prisoners from the United States that were being held hostage in Vietnam, so that then that was Rambo's job, to go there and take pictures of these people that were held hostage so that they could be published to the world, and so that the world actually thought that Vietnam was keeping these people hostage, and so that the United States could excuse themselves from paying these war reparations.
Rambo, you're probably aware that there's almost 2,500 Americans still missing in action in Southeast Asia. Now, most of these boys are presumed killed, but to the League of Families, Congress, and lots of Americans, it's still a very emotional issue. Give me something cold, please. Rambo, you certainly don't know as much about me as I do you. I hunched with the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines in Khartoum in '66. I lost a lot of good men. So I know what you and every vet feels now. Maybe the government didn't care. Maybe certain segments of the population didn't care.
The second scene we chose, which goes from minute 31:50 to 33:15, shows the American prisoners that Rambo was supposed to photograph, but not save. This is quite prominent in the context of the war, of the Cold War, because it supports the previously mentioned idea of the inhumanity of the American government officials that wanted to expose the prisoners to the world as a way to kind of avoid having to pay for war reparations, but essentially avoided at all costs saving their own citizens, their own American citizens, which are shown living in precarious conditions to avoid generating more military conflict with the Vietnamese forces.
Another scene I would like to mention, which is where Rambo sneers at the Russian markings on a ship's floor, and Cobal asks him how he got there to do the mission, and Rambo confesses that he's there because he's almost disposable. Cole also tells her the reason why she is there, which is that her father worked in an intelligence agency during the Cold War, and he was assassinated, and she was called to take his place. So Cole says that there is a lot of death everywhere, and that she just wants to live and maybe go to America to live a quiet life, which portrays the way in which the United States tricked people into having a misconception of the country, which was that everything was, well, perfect, and there was no, there were almost no conflicts in the nation, and so that's why she wanted to go there, because she thought there was a perfect life in there, and in reality there wasn't. It was quite different, but all of this was thanks to the media manipulation of the information during the Cold War.
Russian.
Finally, the third scene was chosen because it shows two American government officials explicitly discussing the Vietnam blackmailing situation. In here, Colonel Troutman exposes the strategic side of matter, explaining how it would be beneficial for the United States, whereas Marshal Murdoch addresses how cruel the government's strategy of blackmail and torture was.
What are you doing? Do you know what the hell you've done?
Don't act so innocent, Colonel. You had your suspicions, and if you suspected then, you're sort of an accessory, aren't you?
Don't ever count me with you and your scum. It was a lie, wasn't it? Just like the whole damn war. It was a lie.
What are you talking about?
That camp was supposed to be empty. Rambo goes in, a decorated vet. He finds no POWs. The Congress buys it. Case closed. And if he happens to get caught, nobody knows he's alive except you and your computers. And you can reprogram that, can't you?
Who in the hell do you think you're talking to, Troutman?
A stinking bureaucrat that's trying to cover his ass.
No, not just mine, Troutman. We're talking about a nation's. Besides, it was your hero's fault. Now, if your warrior had gone in, done what the hell he was supposed to do, we'd be out of this clean and simple. He was just supposed to take pictures.
And if those pictures showed something, they would have been lost, wouldn't they?
Oh, Troutman, I still don't think you understand what this is all about.
The same as it always is. Money. In 72, we were supposed to pay the Kong $4.5 billion in war reparations. We reneged. They kept the POWs. And you're doing the same thing all over again.
What the hell would you do, Troutman? Pay blackmail money to ransom our own men and finance the war effort against our allies?
Can you tell us anything about the book we chose?
The book we chose, I don't know if you guys remember that we read it back in 8th grade. It's The Lord of the Flies by English author William Golding.
Oh yeah, of course, for sure. I remember, I mean, what a classic, now that you mentioned it. In this literary piece, a group of British schoolboys get stranded on an island, and in the book, Golding depicts the behaviors of the different countries involved in the uprising of the Cold War over those 46 years, should I call it? The characters and the situations that they are in are representative of the defensive and polarizing attitudes of the two leading blocs, as we know, the USSR and the USA. However, I got a question for you. In what ways do they show control as a means of gaining power over the population? Like, what stylistic devices or what language styles does Golding use in order to show this to the reader?
I think it's very important to point out that the whole novel is an allusion to the Cold War. William Golding wrote this novel in a very general sense of the entire ideological matter of the conflict. So the two specific pages that we selected to show how this novel represents this conflict, emphasize on the dispute for control between the leading powers through the threat of nuclear violence. So the kid on the island, uncontrollably fighting and pushing each other, represent the rest of the world panicked at the possibility of a nuclear war. And I don't know if you remember the two characters, like the fat boy with the glasses.
Piggy. Yeah.
No, yeah, like the piggy, the piggy, the fat one is Piggy, and there was like this athletic, skinny one, and his dad had a lot of money. Blah,
That's
blah.
Ralph.
That's Ralph. One represents the USSR, which is Piggy, and the other one, Ralph, is representative of the United States. And them fighting, and they represent like the United States and the Soviet Union quarreling over which one of them would resort to using their nuclear weapons first within the Cold War.
So I think it's also important to mention that this work is very rich in allegorical meaning, and its inclusion of representative characters was also one of the reasons behind the selection of this fragment.
Yes, and also, you know, the glasses on Piggy, they're very important because I don't know if you guys remember that there's a point in which Piggy, like they tried to take Piggy's glasses to put them on the floor so that the sun would go in and start a fire.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so the point, like Piggy's glasses represent like the new technology of the nuclear weapons because they were, you know, very new at that time and they hadn't been used before, like so much, right? So in this context, like in the sense that island, like they were stranded on an island, there was no technology, no nothing, and although like glasses are very mainstream, it was like the only modern artifact that they could use to, like, you know, start a fire.
Oh, God. They broke my glasses.
Pretty interesting to see how, in all of the art media, the Cold War was eventually reflected. But we also have to talk about propaganda, especially the politically related one. And in this case, we have a comic strip I would like to share. It is worth noticing that comics and cartoons played quite a role in displaying young conformities with war and politically related topics, something that is quite prominent, shall I say, when powers wanted to show how they were against other ideologies, especially, well, communism and capitalism.
The comic strip that was selected is titled Is This Tomorrow, which we can see in here. And it was published at the beginning of the Cold War in 1947 by the Catechetical Guild Educational Society in the United States. So the reason it was chosen is because it portrays the fear and utter explosion with which the United States government would avoid the spread of communism. So this comic strip also shows a possible scenario of how America would be like if it lost the war against the Soviet Union and gave it into the infamous planned economy of the Soviet Union, which includes common ownership and plasma society model.
The fictional scenario that, well, Americans decide to depict in this case really portrayed the intentions of the Soviet Union, or at least the ones the USA thought they had, in terms of obtaining world supremacy. This comic strip was also chosen because it shows the aspect of the American anti-communist internal policy, as it was a product of Senator Joseph McCarthy, of McCarthy's campaign actually, investigating alleged communists that were hiding in the United States, perhaps as spies. This piece of media, however, also evidences the dishonesty which the American government will occasionally resort to during the Cold War, as McCarthyism was also a practice that involved making unfounded or false accusations of treason to taint the name of anarchism and communism as much as possible, so that people that liked or were against the communist model would stay supporting capitalism.
Let's talk a little more about McCarthyism, right? So this comic strip was posted like to support the sense of McCarthyism, but there's a lot of propaganda about McCarthyism and powered by this ideology. So we would like to share an anti-communist propaganda.
Yeah, we would love to. We chose an anti-communist propaganda which is a poster drawn by Edmund Waldman in 1954, which is only a few years after the Cold War began. He's an Estonian and American editorial cartoonist, and his targets included national and international presidents and leaders. So it was chosen as it is also part of the previously mentioned campaign of McCarthyism. This cartoon illustrates an elephant, symbol and representation of the Republican Party in the US, known for being right-wing oriented, looking down from a ship, representative of the US, where a banner with the name of the previously mentioned doctrine is floating and dissolving into the water.
The poster shows the U.S. government's worry for the possible loss of this practice of McCarthyism, which is, the making false accusations and treason when related to political models such as communism, which was an important element of the containment of communism in the US during the Cold War.
I think that in the same way, we can see how the Soviet Union also repulsed pro-capitalist ideals, which can be seen in propaganda featuring pro-communist ways of being.
Now that both of you mentioned that, I think we can see a trend here, which is, creating propaganda, comic strips, cartoons that oppose the different ideologies, as we can see. But we haven't talked about the pro-communist propagandas. The one we chose displays one of the most relevant Cold War events of the 70s, the Vietnam War, which we talked about before. And in this piece, created by the Soviet Union, of course, the nation shows its respect for the Vietnamese people, who in the moment were in a bloody conflict in the US that lasted maybe 20 or more years, which led to the USSR government to start publishing propaganda like this, one indirectly sending a message to the rest of the world that meant to state how the American country invaded Vietnam, looking as the enemy that had to be, protected, Propaganda like this shows the constant tension that existed within capitalist and communist countries, and how centenary strategies like this always meant to reinforce each part's ideologies while discrediting their opponents.
I think it's important, taking into account these two samples of propaganda, that gaining the love of the public opinion was very important during the margin of the Cold War, because at the end it was an ideological conflict. So by posting a poster that was defending those who were victims of the American government, what the USSR was trying to do was to gain the love from the public opinion of those who were discriminated by the US government, so that the US government didn't have a good look towards the rest of the world.